get started here. Thank you everyone for coming to our afternoon keynote on our first day of the Equity in Education, Decolonizing Education. Cindy Domingo has been an activist for almost 50 years, using her skills as an organizer, writer, political strategist, mentor, public servant, and speaker to create social change in the world. Cindy began her activism in the 1970s as a student at the University of Washington and during the struggle to restore democracy in the Philippines, then under the rule of dictators Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos. As a member of the radical organization Union of Democratic Filipinos, the KDP, Cindy served as an organizer in the Filipino American community. In 1981, Cindy's brother Silme was murdered along with KDP activist and fellow trade union officer Jean Viernes because of their anti-Marcos and pro-democracy activism. As chair of the Committee for Justice for Domingo and Viernes, Cindy spent the following 10 years leading a successful movement to bring to justice those responsible for the murders, including the Marcoses. In a landmark federal civil suit, the Marcoses were found liable for the murders in order to pay $23.5 million to the Domingo and Viernes' families. 40 years later, Cindy is now trying to hold the US government accountable for their roles in the murders and the cover-up. As an independent scholar and writer, Cindy has presented papers at national and international conferences on her brother's case, the Filipino American history, and Asian American labor history. In 2017, the University of Washington published A Time to Rise, a collective memories of the Union of Democratic Filipinos, which Cindy served as co-editor. She also published a story in the book Women Against Marcos, Stories of Filipino and Filipino American Women Fought a Dictator. Domingo continues to work for democracy in the Philippines as a member of the Akbayan North America. Cindy has served on local, national, and international boards and organizations, including the National Asian Pacific Women's Forum, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, American Friends Service Committee's Third World Coalition, International Examiner Newspaper, Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance Seattle chapter, Campaign to End the Occupation of Western Sahara, and National Network on Cuba. She serves as the chair of LILO, a Legacy of Leadership, Equality, and Organizing, and has dedicated the last 20 years of her life on building solidarity with Cuba, especially with Cuban women, and working to uplift the 61-year-old US blockade. Cindy Domingo attended the University of Washington in Seattle and received a master's degree in Philippine history from Goddard College in Vermont. She resides in Seattle with many activists in her family. And I just want to say thank you so much. I'm honored to have Cindy Domingo here as someone who has looked up to her for years and who has worked with her colleague Velma Valoria, a former representative of Washington State. It is an absolute honor to have you here today, Cindy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sharon. And I was looking so forward to meeting you personally after working with you for a couple of years during the pandemic and hoping to see others in person at this conference. But thank you so much to the organizers of this conference and the Equity in Education Coalition for inviting me here today. Thank you also to my friend Velma Valoria, who probably put forth my name as a speaker. You know, you have these friends who you know when you call, when they call you, it's not just to see if you're okay, even though they want to know if you're okay, but it's to do something. And while you think, well, I'm not sure if I want to answer that call because you know that it means work, but you do call. You call her back because I've known Velma for almost 45 years. And I know that Velma doesn't play and that she must be calling about something important. She had me working so hard last week that I probably won't pick up a phone call from her for the next 2 months. But anyway, when Velma called me and asked me to speak about decolonizing education, I laughed and said, Velma, I'm not sure I know anything about that topic. Well, Velma can be very convincing and good at supporting others to see their experiences in a different light. And after some coaxing, I agreed. And it's been a learning experience for me, looking at how my experiences as an activist for radical change, as a child of immigrant parents, as one that went through public school and going on to get a master's in Philippine history, as someone that's a parent of 2 children that went to public schools and private schools. And when I look at all those experiences, I thought, yes, all of that had to do with my understanding of decolonizing education. I listened to lectures on the internet, including Pedro Noguera's 2019 speech at your last conference here in Washington. And I also listened the other day to a webinar on literacy and education in Cuba, which I'll talk about later in this conversation. Those all helped me to make this speech today. Velma told me to tell my story because that's what decolonizing education is all about. Ensuring that our voices and stories are part of educating our children, our teachers, and our communities. And so that's what I'm going to do over the next hour. I'm not going to speak for an hour, but I'm hoping we can have a great dialogue over the next hour and so. We just finished Filipino American History Month, which is the month of October. And my story is in part celebrating that month. Every month should be decolonizing education month. And so for the next hour, I'll talk, and hopefully we can then have a dialogue about Filipino American history experience through mine and my family's story, and what our hopes, what our dreams for our children are and our peoples, and we can have an exchange to learn from each other, because that's part of decolonizing education, not a hierarchical system, but learning from each other. Just as you know that the first documentation of Filipinos first setting foot on the continent, now known as the United States, was back in 1587 in Morro Bay in California. Just a tidbit of information so you know a little bit background about Filipinos. But the first Filipino migration in large numbers came after the turn of the 20th century. And that is when my family's story begins here in the United States. So let me tell you a little bit about my family. I am the daughter of Nemesio Domingo Sr. and Adelina Domingo, and my mother unfortunately just passed away last February. Both immigrants of the Philippines, but both with different immigrant stories. My father immigrated to the United States via Hawaii in 1926 at the age of 16 with 2 brothers and other young men from the northern part of the Philippines called Ilocos. And they were recruited by Filipino contractors, recruited as laborers for the agricultural and salmon canning industries. Promises of adventure, good money, and education. My father and his 2 brothers jumped at the opportunity over the protest of their father, who was a peasant and needed them to help till the land in their own country. But they left. My father and one of his brothers never returned to live in the Philippines as they made the United States their permanent home. Thus, my father became part of the wave of Asian laborers, first the Chinese, then the Japanese, and once the United States closed their doors on them, the need for cheap labor opened for Filipino immigrants. But the immigration of Filipinos was also tied to the US becoming a colony of the United States. In the wars of 1898, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba were sold off to Spain, to the United States, in the Treaty of Paris, thus opening all 3 of those countries to a colonial relationship with the United States. Cuba finally liberated their country in 1959 after Fidel Castro and the July 26th movement overthrew the Bautista dictatorship. And we all know today, Puerto Rico is still a colony of the United States. The Philippines became the site of the first imperialist war abroad called the Filipino-American War, when US soldiers, including the Buffalo Soldiers who fought the Indians in the expansion of the US to the West Coast, were sent to conquer the Philippines and bring it under US rule. Filipinos fought until as late as 1914 in areas of the Philippines for their independence. But just as quickly as an area was pacified by US soldiers, American teachers called the Thomasites were brought in to begin the process of colonization, to teach Filipinos that A stood for apple, even though at that time there were no apples in the Philippines, that English was a far superior language than the hundreds of languages spoken in the over 1,000 islands that make up the Philippines, and that the democracy in the United States was the democracy of civilized people. And that's why the Philippine Congress and their political system is patterned right after the United States' political system. And while we are led to believe that the United States granted the Philippines its independence in 1946, the Philippines was forced to open its borders to the colonial process. The Philippines gave up its education system, language, and its peoples and its natural resources when the US colonized the country. It's a legacy that continues today and is deeply ingrained in the Filipino people, that anything that has the US logo, the US name on it, must be better than any Philippine brand. Thus, my father came to the United States to become a laborer first in the agricultural fields in Hawaii, and then a year later to Seattle to become part of the migratory workforce who worked up and down the West Coast in the agricultural fields, picking asparagus, hops, apples, and whatever was being harvested, going to Alaska during the summers, and then returning to Seattle to go to Eastern Washington to start that agricultural picking migration again. Often he worked as a houseboy, as they called the grown Filipino men, or worked in kitchens in hotels or restaurants, living in the International District in Seattle or other boarding houses. And when he had longer periods of job stability, he managed to finish his high school education at the school that is now part of Seattle College on Broadway. His life was like so many of the generation we call the Manong generation, a term of endearment for those older men who are pretty much gone now. A generation whose voices, lives, and contributions to this country might have died with them, if not for my generation who began to search for our history of our fathers, our uncles, and our peoples. These men were humble. And I remember one time when we were doing an oral history and photo exhibit of these Manongs, they were reluctant because they felt embarrassed and ashamed that they had not accomplished much in their lives. They wondered, why would we want to honor them? Why would we want to take photographs of them? There's in the International District, there's a hotel called the Eastern Hotel that I hope you will look into or visit one day. And it has a Carlos Abulosan Memorial Historical exhibit that pays tribute to the contributions of that generation in the International District. But we understood that history books and newspapers forget that it was that generation who had been the backbone of the farm workers' struggle. They started the great grape strike, and they were the power behind the formation of the United Farm Workers and the formation of the union that organized cannery workers as well as agricultural workers. That cannery union still exists today. It was this generation that our generation has to thank for purchasing two buildings that have become Filipino community centers, one in Seattle and one in Wapato, the only Filipino community centers that exist in the entire mainland United States. My father's life took an unwanted turn during World War II, because since he immigrated while the Philippines was under US colonial rule, the terms of immigration were set. They dictated that during wartime, he and other subjects, as they called them, from the Philippines, could be drafted to serve in the military during wartime. And so with one fell swoop, my father became a US citizen and a US Army soldier at the same time, and began to serve in the first all-Filipino infantry regiment. Because we can't forget that even though we were in the war and we were recruiting men of color, it doesn't mean that they could serve with white soldiers. So that there were special units, battalions, regiments made up of all Black, all Latino, Native American, Japanese, Chinese, and Filipino regiments. These were all widely decorated regiments and battalions taking on some of the most difficult and dangerous assignments. My father went on to being assigned to the Philippines, where he met my mother, who was 16 years old. And within a year, they were married. By 1950, my mother crossed the ocean in a grueling trip by ship with two small children to join my father in San Francisco and then on to Texas. Much like my father, my mother didn't know what she would see, what to expect, and then who she would know. But I remember the cutest story my mother always told us about her immigration to the United States. Her biggest worry was that someone told her that there was no rice in the United States. And so her biggest worry was, how was she going to live without eating any rice for the rest of her life? That obviously that was not a true reality in her life. This history is special to my family because we know that many families do not know their history, especially African Americans. My mother, like most women, felt it was important to impart these stories to us before they left us. For the most part, maybe because it was difficult, my father didn't talk a lot about the past and the discrimination he faced as an immigrant in the early part of the 20th century. My mother told us that my father was afraid of fire because he almost died in a fire that had been set while he and others were sleeping in a barn on a farm that they were working on. And although that had happened decades before, my father was still afraid of fire. As a result of my father's military service, we grew up in Ballard, as Fort Lawton was still an active military base. And so if you know of any longtime families of color in Ballard, it was because their fathers were in the Army. At Ballard High School, there was probably 15 students of color. 5 were bused in from the South, and the other 10, the majority of them, their fathers were in the service. My father retired with a 100% military disability, and therefore all 5 of us siblings went to the University of Washington under the GI Bill, as well as a few scholarships from our academic achievements. We were well on our way to becoming the epitome of the model Filipino-American family living the good American dream. As my brother wanted to become a lawyer, I wanted to be a pharmacist, my sister a nurse, etc. All we needed to complete that Filipino-American dream with someone to become a doctor. But as hard as they tried, my parents could not make us that good Filipino American family. And the political period of the 1960s and the 1970s swept up all their children. We all eventually became activists, swept into the social movements of the anti-Vietnam War movements, the Asian American identity movements, and ultimately, some of us joined radical organizations like the Students for Democratic Society, and my brother and myself and my sister joined the radical Filipino organization called the Union of Democratic Filipinos, or more widely known as the KDP, and Velma was one of those young people. It was the political period and those radical organizations that began to decolonize our minds and our lives on a very fast track. Much of what we had learned in school was called into question as revolutionary movements in Asia, Latin America, and Africa took up struggles for national liberation and won power. On campus, at the UW, and in the community, we began to learn about the struggles of the world and the history of colonialism in those parts of the world, and why people took up peaceful and armed struggle. Certain professors who helped us understand the world in a new framework were in high demand as their classes were packed. I took my first classes in Philippine history and Asian American history, and combined with my first trip to the Philippines in 1974, I was awakened to a new worldview, a new relationship with my Filipino American identity, and my finding of a new homeland country, the Philippines. At the time, I was a pharmacy university student, but the world looked new to me, and I cast that aside. And this is not any kind of criticism of pharmacists or degrading to that profession, but I just couldn't see myself being a pharmacist anymore. Changing the world, organizing people to make changes in our society, understanding how our history impacted the present and our future became much more interesting than becoming a pharmacist. My older brother, who was on track to go to school to become a lawyer, and my brother Salmi, who I'll talk about later in this presentation, helped find a dynamic organization called LILO, which has been renamed now to stand for A Legacy of Equality, Leadership, and Organizing. And they joined Black construction workers and Latinx farm workers and Asian American and Pacific Islanders and Alaska Natives and women to use the civil rights laws of 1964 to fight discrimination in the unions and to gain the right to organize farm workers in the agricultural fields and to fight discrimination in the construction trades and the canneries. In a book that was just published by university professors Michael McCann and George Lavelle called Union by Law, Filipino American labor activists, rights, radicalism, and racial capitalism, they write the history of the LILO movement that was made by this multiracial grouping is one not found anywhere else in the United States. And it's learning about this type of history that is part of decolonizing education. But it's really a combination of learning our true history and being part of a radical organization that made the difference for myself and two of my siblings. Being in an activist organization taught us about the importance of relationships and trust, because you can't be a good organizer if you can't build good relationships and trust with people. We engrossed ourselves with learning about the history of the Philippines under US rule and Spanish colonialism. We learned about the inequality of our society, especially for people of color. We learned about the inequality of housing, education, and employment. But most of all, we learned as a collective movement that we can change society. Remember the famous quote of Paulo Freire, education does not transform the world. Education changes people, and people change the world. There is no other one thing that is more powerful than people coming together, knowing that they can change society, can correct an injustice, can challenge racism and gender discrimination. It is life-changing and empowering. But oftentimes that comes at a price. And on June 1st, 1981, my brothers Salmi Domingo and Jean Vernis were murdered in Pioneer Square in Seattle in the offices of the Alaska Cannery Workers Union, Local 37, then affiliated with the International Longshore and Warehousemen's Union. They were murdered because they dared to change the world in the form of changing US foreign policy and ending support for the Marcos dictatorship in the Philippines. Remember earlier, I talked about the Manong generation, and it was some of these old men who had begun to mentor Salmi and Jean and told them the history of organizing in the Alaska salmon canneries and how they fought both the cannery owners and the corrupt union officials. The Manongs were the inspiration and source of lessons for the successful discrimination lawsuits against the cannery owners. But the Manongs were also the source of inspiration for the idea of the importance of international solidarity between the workers in the United States and workers who were fighting for democracy in the homeland of the Philippines. As Jean and Salmi talked with the Manongs, they also learned the history of how that generation used their labor positions to bring to light the struggles of workers in the Philippines. For our generation, it was an opportunity to bring to light what was happening in the Philippines under the repressive dictatorship of Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, and in particular, the repression that labor was undergoing and the human rights abuses. But what we did not understand from history was that building international solidarity, especially as labor activists, put Salmi and Jean at a very dangerous crossroad, which would ultimately cause their assassinations. After launching a successful campaign to win officer positions in the Alaska Cannery Workers Union, Salmi and Jean and a reformed slate took control over almost all of the positions in that union, all the positions except for the presidency. About 6 months later, Jean Vernis went to the Philippines on his first time ever to visit relatives to find his Filipino roots. While there, he met with the radical labor movement leaders who had been forced to go underground by the dictatorship. Jean eventually left the Philippines after a couple of weeks with a letter in hand from those progressive labor leaders, and hand carried the letter to the International Convention of the ILWU, where he and Salmi passed a controversial resolution to send an ILWU investigating team to the Philippines to investigate labor conditions there. This would have been the first step in the eventual condemnation of the Marcos regime by the progressive labor movement led by the progressive ILWU. Unfortunately, the only other time that a US labor union had ever taken a position about the Philippines was when Cesar Chavez of the UFW went to the Philippines and was wined and dined by the Marcoses. Chavez came back supportive of the Marcos dictatorship, and it split the union, with Filipino officers leaving that union. 1 month after passing the resolution in Hawaii, Salmi and Jean were murdered in their union office in Pioneer Square during the work rush hour. 7 years later, in 1989, in a landmark lawsuit in federal court, we held the Marcoses As Sharon said, we held the Marcoses liable for the murders of Salmi and Jean. And today we're still trying to prove that the United States participated in the cover-up and were complicit in spying and harassing the US-based anti-Marcos movement. The winning of this case could not have happened without the building of a transnational and national movement for justice for Domingo and Berenice. Could not have happened without the education of the true nature of US foreign policy and the domestic implications of that foreign policy. Justice could not have happened without the education of what types of crimes get committed under the guise of national security. This is the type of critical education that our people need to understand the true nature of what we call our democracy here in the United States, and that we must organize to change that type of so-called democracy. The work of the Committee for Justice for Domingo and Berenice has occupied 40 years of my life. And you could say that it has been my lifetime work in educating people of who Salmi and Jean were, what they were doing that caused their political assassinations, and what the true nature of our democracy is about when it comes to foreign policy and national security. And again, that is decolonizing education, when you expose that to people and educate them about our government. But while I have talked about I've been in many empowering situations and movements, I'll tell you the most disempowering place I have ever been, that I've ever dealt with, is my experience with the Seattle public school system and the education of one of my children. I have two sons. They are biracial, as my husband is African American. And while I realize that children have different learning styles, I also know the difference in the treatment of my two sons were greatly influenced by the color of their skin. As my oldest son is very light-skinned, and my youngest son, Jamil, who struggled through school, is more of a darker skinned man. And from my perspective and my husband's perspective, we did everything right in terms of trying to raise our children so that they could succeed. We're a middle-class family. Our children were never hungry. They were always housed. They're surrounded by family. We read to our children almost every night. We helped them do their homework. We exposed them to various communities and experiences, took them to Kumon classes to help them with their math, brought them to political events, and talked to them about what was happening in the world. And coming from an activist family, they were surrounded by stimulating discussions and lots of different people. But nothing prepared us when at age 5, the teacher, who was originally from the Netherlands, said Jamil was not interested in reading. Of course, my husband, Gary, went to talk to the teacher and asked to see the books she was using. And I tell you, those books she was using reminded, maybe some of you are too young to know about the Dick and Jane books, but the book she was using from the Netherlands reminded us of the Dick and Jane books, all white characters and boring as hell. You know, it was like, look, Jane, look, Dick, see Jane run, see Dick run too. Gary assured the teacher that Jamil was definitely interested in reading and learning, and then brought some of Jamil's favorite books. You know, he liked action books like Star Wars. He liked books about with Black characters. His favorite book was about Bill Pickett, the Black Cowboy. But when Gary suggested that she look for more books with more diverse characters, she shrugged it off. She shrugged her shoulders and said she was happy with the book she had and other children liked them. The principal also didn't seem interested in intervening because the teacher was her good friend. So the next year, we transferred to TOPS, the #1 draw school for the entire Seattle school district at the time. We thought we were the luckiest family in the world with both our boys accepted. But a few months later into the school year, Jamil's teacher wanted to put Jamil into special education, saying he had difficulties and couldn't keep up with the class and he was a poor reader. Once again, we went to a meeting and asked for the principal to be at the meeting. The principal at that time was Gary Tubbs, an exceptional person. And after arguing with the teacher and showing Jamil's work he produced at home, drawing, writing, bringing in the books he liked, Gary Tubbs said he would conduct the aptitude testing himself. The results of the testing were fine. Jamil was a good learner, he said, but did need a little help in reading, and so was assigned a special reading class. Not surprising, all of the students in the special reading class were kids of color. Right before summer that year, in an attempt to keep tutoring Jamil in reading, I asked the resource reading teacher, did he have any resources or did he have a tutor I could hire to help Jamil continue with his reading? And the resource teacher said no, he didn't know of any. Kind of a strange answer to me if you're the resource reading teacher. Off and on, Jamil had successes and difficulties, depending on the teacher and Jamil, which is most important to Jamil. It all depended on Jamil's level of trust and relationship with the teacher. Over the course of time at TOPS and his preschool, he was fortunate to have 3 Black teachers whom he loved and performed well for. He was fortunate to have those teachers, but all 3 contracted cancer, and 2 died while they were his teachers. There was no effort to counsel the kids, to help them deal with their grief or why their teacher left so suddenly. But to this day, we still have a special relationship with the one surviving Black teacher, his second grade teacher, Willie. It was not until Jamil's junior year in high school at Ballard High School that I had my final straw. It was just my final straw with the Seattle Public School. Jamil's biology teacher asked to meet me because Jamil was failing his biology class. And at the meeting, the teacher asked me, after a few minutes, if I ever thought of having Jamil run track. And now Jamil has awfully long legs and is thin, but that question kind of threw me for a loop. I said, no, I never thought about asking if you wanted to do track, but then the teacher kept pressing me. And finally I said, I don't know what track has to do with what we're talking about. He said he was a track coach and maybe that would help Jamil if he joined the track club. After a little while, I said, I have to go, but that I didn't see what this had to do with Jamil failing biology. The next day, I went to an alternative public high school called the Ida B. Wells School of Social Justice to plead my case to let my son in. For me, this was the last resort for Jamil if he was ever going to graduate. For a couple of weeks, I pleaded my case, brought Jamil in to see if he was going to be a good fit, and finally, they allowed him in. And within 1 month, Jamil, who had actually been quite depressed at Ballard, became a changed person. He was happy, and he said to me, it felt good to be told that you were doing a good job and to get positive feedback. I asked myself, what happened? Well, the school was a small school of 30 or so students, mostly all kids of color, and mostly all of them were the throwaways of our public school system. But at this school, they thrived. They were valued. They had a good relationship with the 2 teachers. They had an integrated social justice curriculum, and they discussed what was happening in society today. They were told they were not permitted to fail. They were told they can't answer by "I don't know." And the students kept each other accountable for the success of the other student. The school was at the University of Washington campus, and hopefully many of these students saw that they themselves could go to college if they wanted. They owned their own literature books so that they would value books, and every subject was taught with a social justice perspective. It wasn't just one ethnic studies course, but a whole curriculum with a social justice perspective. There was another school just like this one, taught at High Point in West Seattle. They were called the middle colleges. The statistics on the graduation rates were amazing. But the school district decided that small schools were too expensive. But too expensive for who? A bunch of children of color? Too expensive to invest in the success of children of color? Too expensive to invest in a social justice curriculum? And when we turned to the UW EOP office for help, because the school was a joint program with them, after 20 years, the EOP program was concerned that the UW could get sued for any harm that would come from having youth under 18 on campus, as if there weren't other young people on campus under the age of 18. When we tried to get a follow-up meeting with EOP, we couldn't get a return call. And one of the teachers of color who taught at the schools, after 20 years teaching science, his credentials were called into question because he didn't have a supposed biology credential, although biology is not taught at the senior level of high school. He was put in limbo for months and then finally transferred to another school. And the Latino teacher who was sent, who taught at High Point, was sent to Ballard to teach, where obviously they don't have many children of color at Latino, Latinx, or Black children at Ballard High School. And another staff at Ida B. Wells was investigated for 1 year for falsifying records. And then the charges were dropped with no discussion. But by then, the school, as we know, it was dismantled. And the school board, well, never mind, because the school was dismantled. So you see, when we create and have a model that works, that empowers the children, it is taken away from us. And the teachers of color who are dedicated to centering the students, for building trust with those students, for helping them in all of their needs, those teachers were persecuted. That was my experience with the Seattle school system. My son graduated, and there is no doubt, without the wonderful two teachers at Ida B. Wells and the love that they showed him and the confidence they instilled in him, he would not be who he is today. And today, he is in his last year at the electrical apprenticeship program and making more money than most of his nieces and nephews. And I mean, his cousins. And I heard, when I think of the damage that my son would have carried on in his life if I had not gotten him into the Ida B. Wells School of Social Justice, and if he had not been cared and loved for by those teachers, Roger Rigor and Mary Ellen Cardella. I owe them my son's life. But we know that our education system was never meant to educate all races and all classes. We know that our current education system is one of the reasons that the country is struggling to save our democracy now. It is one of the reasons, a great reasons, why our country is so divided. And it's probably one of the reasons why, out of yesterday's election, we will not probably meet a 50% threshold of the people that were voting, that could have voted. But what gives me hope? Yesterday, Renika wrote me and said that I should talk about what gives me hope, because I wake up with hope most of the days. But that's why I want to talk about Cuba. Some of you who know me know that I always find a way to talk about Cuba, and that in my 20 years of going to Cuba, I go there to find hope and to renew energy. But the topic of decolonizing education is right up the alley, when it comes to Cuba, because they got it figured out. And if you are a follower of Paulo Freire's philosophy, and you need to go to Cuba and look at their education system and learn about the history of their revolution and how their education system was a part of their continuing revolution and the process of country building and patriotism. And I'm not talking about the type of patriotism that happened on January 6th in Washington, D.C. this year. Cuba overthrew the Bautista dictatorship in 1959. And at that time, 23.6% of the population over 10 years old was illiterate. And 600,000 were without schools. And 10,000 teachers were out of work. On September 26, 1960, Fidel Castro announced at his speech at the United Nations that Cuba would be illiteracy free by the end within 1 year's time. And to accomplish that tremendous effort, the Cuban government had to mobilize the entire country. Now remember that this literacy campaign was being launched in the midst of a war with the United States to defend the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban people grasped what Paulo Freire said, that freedom is acquired by conquest and is not a gift. Therefore, the whole country was mobilized to eradicate illiteracy. It became a nation-building exercise as the issue of education and literacy was fought in the context of the social and economical context of what Cuba was going through at that time. The literacy campaign brought together the urban people and the rural people to educate the urban people on the conditions and lives of the rural people, with the mission not to just teach the poor how to read and write, but to form a relationship with a common goal, common spirit, and they ultimately to foster a common love of country. That's the type of patriotism that was built through the literacy campaign. 250,000 volunteers were recruited in the literacy campaign and taught 700,000 people to read and write. 100,000 of those volunteers were under the age of 18, with the youngest volunteer being 8 years old, and he is still alive today to tell the story. Over half the volunteers were women, many of them who had never left their own vicinities or lived in any other home but their parents. They went to the countryside to serve in the literacy campaign. And if some of you have not seen the film Maestra, which is the documentary of the literacy campaign, I really encourage you to go on YouTube and its Google website, Maestra the Film, that's the name of the website, Maestra the Film. And the film again is named Maestra, done by my friend Catherine Murphy. The literacy campaign was fought like a war and brought the country together. All at the Literacy Museum in Havana, the director, Luisa Campos, showed some of us the documentation of that literacy campaign, including documents that show who the teacher was and the student that the teacher taught. All students were required to write a letter to Fidel Castro upon their graduation. And Luisa's favorite letter from a peasant man who wrote that only when he learned to read and write did he really feel that he was a Cuban. Many of the literacy brigadistas, as they were called, when you talk to them, will still get tears in their eyes when they talk about their experiences in going to the countryside to teach the peasants. They say of all their experiences in their long lives, that experience was the most important experience in their life. Today, education remains free all the way through college, even medical school. Many people I know have more than one master's degree, and for women, it has been the hallmark of their freedom. Women brigadistas say they participated in the literacy campaign and never, ever looked back. It is the reason that women dominate the sciences in Cuba and are the majority of healthcare providers, representing 70% of the doctors trained in Cuba. We have much to learn from Cuba about education, of how it is used to nation build, and not just for individual advancement, but for the development of a common patriotism for the development of their country. This year is the 60th anniversary of the literacy campaign, as well as the founding of the Teachers National Union that was founded by those that taught in the literacy campaign. So that is my source of hope for the world, is that we can reconstruct an education system like theirs. With all the resources we have in the United States, we can decolonize education. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy, so much. That was, I have tears, just absolute tears. Thank you so much for your words of wisdom, for your history, your passion. For those folks who have joined us halfway through this, please drop some questions in the chat if you want to ask anything to Cindy. Cindy, I have a couple of questions that I know I personally want to ask you. My first one being, it's interesting that you bring up the Cuban commitment to public education. My parents are from Central America. My dad is from El Salvador and my mom is from Guatemala. And I'm often shocked at the commitment that they have to public education. It is free to get all the way through to your doctorate, to become a lawyer, to become a doctor. All of that is actually free for residents of the country. So it's sometimes shocking to me that we don't have the same commitment to public education as we do in different countries. And we often laugh at countries like that as being underdeveloped or third world or whatever you want to call them, yet they have committed so much of their internal infrastructure and resources to ensuring that our residents and our communities are educated. One of the questions that I wanted to ask you is, given everything that you've seen in the United States, what do you see as the hope of America?
Well, I see the young people today. The young people are mobilizing in a way that I have never seen. Last summer, when Black Lives Matter challenged police violence, challenged essentially the structure that this country has been built on in terms of policing. And as people say, it was the longest sustained demonstrations, marches that this country has ever seen. Young people are not going to go with the status quo anymore. And if we can continue to join with them to mobilize, you're going to see big changes happening in this country. I'm also energized and hopeful about some of our elected officials. Pramila Jayapal. We have one of the most powerful representatives, congresswomen here in this area. She's my congresswoman, and she is leading the Progressive Caucus to use their power to leverage votes on this Building America bill. They wanted to take everything out of that bill, saying they couldn't afford it. And I think with young people And some of us that are left who have the energy to keep fighting. And if we elect more leaders like Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, we can really make some changes. But I think the education system will be one of the hardest to change because it just is a hard nut to crack. You know, I mean, our education system was built to essentially, not educate a certain portion of our society, to only create further divisions, to repress certain classes, certain racial minorities and peoples. And so I hope that the young people will lead in terms of also reforming, not just reforming, because I think we have to completely dismantle our education system. We can make certain reforms. I mean, I think we're making certain ones. They're going to make Filipino history classes a accredited course in high schools and teach it in grade schools. But we have to do much more than that. We have to do much more than just have one ethnic studies class, one Filipino history class. We have to have an integrated curriculum in which all of our histories are taught, and we teach children and young people about what is happening in society with a very critical lens.
Cindy, another question is, with your experience with revolutions, and I know Velma will pipe up probably here, what would you like to see happen as we try to revolutionize or decolonize our educational system?
Well, I think we have to write our own books. I'll give you an example. Devin, who works for the Seattle School District, said that Filipino history is going to be made part of the Seattle education system. But we don't have the books. We don't have the books at the grade school level. We don't have the books at even the high school level. And so we have to write our own stories. I mean, I think that that's why I told the story of our family, because our family in certain ways is no different from a lot of other families that immigrated to this country. Velma's story is a very important story. Those kinds of stories can serve as inspiration to the children that are in the schools. They see themselves, representation is important, but representation isn't everything. And we also have to train our teachers differently. I mean, it's such a huge ball of wax, as I'm sure you know, because you are in this business and this work. And I don't think that anybody has the answer to everything in it, but we have to start somewhere.
Any questions from folks? Y'all know I can ask questions all day. So if you want to raise your hand, or I know it's late in the evening, so y'all might be shy. Maya says, can you say more about how you'd like to see teacher training change or improve?
Well, I'm not a trained educator, even though I actually got my master's degree in Philippine history because I wanted to teach Philippine history, but there were never the opportunities to do that. And at that time, it was the only place you could get a master's in Philippine history. Things have changed very, very, very drastically now. So I have my own opinions about what could be done in terms of teaching teachers how to teach. I participate. I think a good model. I participate in the Wing Luke's. It's a 1-week training that they do 2 times during the summer, in which they do a whole week of training around Asian American and Pacific Islander history. And these teachers come all the way, they range all the way from grade schools to high schools to colleges. And they are exposed not only to people who make history or who have made history, but academics as well as community organizers. But they're also taken to sites in the Pacific Northwest that have relevancy to Asian American and Pacific Islander and Native Hawaiian history. And it's a really great model because it's not only academic readings and speech and presentations, but it's very interactive. And for me, it seems they've gotten very good reviews from it. And that could be one model that could be used as a way to educate educators about certain portions of history. But I also like, I think, again, I think that many people and many of us need to write our own histories. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we did that book, A Time to Rise, which was essentially an anthology of over 30 stories of people who were in the KDP and who made those years of history. And they're ordinary people. Many of them are like young people now who became activists through different social movements and then joined the KDP. But I think it gives you a real sense, especially for younger people, of the different experiences that can turn you into an activist and inspire you to take up work to change conditions in this country. And that's the kind of inspiration I think our young people need these days, and to interact with those stories and to interact with people that are still alive that have made that kind of history.
I'm on mute. Angelica has a great point here. After 18 months, you would think that I would know already. One of the things that Angelica says is that we're not ready to teach non-white perspectives on history without acknowledging and making some changes first. We are jumping ahead to all the good without doing the tough internalized work. How do we do this work such as decolonizing ourselves? And, it's one of the conversations that we have here at the EEC a lot. We often want to go quickly to that coalition building of getting folks together to do the work and fight against white supremacy. And, one of my colleagues, Sumait Mel, was very clear the other day of pointing out that we can't do the public white supremacy, anti-white supremacy work without tackling the internal anti-immigrant, anti-Black, anti-Indigenous colorism work of our own communities. I sometimes see that as the biggest challenge. But Cindy, what are your words of wisdom when it comes to trying to do both of them at the same time? I think a lot of us want to get there, but also there's also all this anti shit that we have to deal with in our own communities. What are your words of wisdom in that?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because we have to deal with them in our own families, right? I've dealt with them, homophobia, anti-Black. When I decided to marry my husband, my parents, who I thought were so open-minded, my mother had a cow. But I think we don't have a choice. For those of us that are in this work for the long haul, we don't have a choice. We have to work together in coalitions and alliances, but we have to do the hard internal work with our own peoples, as well as building the alliances and coalitions with white folks. It is, as Sumait says, it's a kind of a triple, quadruple job, but you can't just take one separate from the other. You can't have a theoretical discussion about racism and discrimination or homophobia and have that sit in a box, because only when it comes to true working relationships, then do you really get to the nitty-gritty, and only then you can really engage people to have those kinds of more open discussions. And people will, actually, one time there was a period when Lilo was doing some talking circles with Mexican men who were working through Casa Latina and African-American construction work. And for those that participated in those discussions, they said they were the best discussions ever they had, because they overcame their stereotypes of Mexicans, overcame their stereotypes of African-American men, and they found that they had common experiences when it came to racism and discrimination. And yes, it took a long time to get there, but it takes a long time to build trust and to open up, to truly open up about one's life experiences, especially if you're faced discrimination and racism, most of your life here in the United States. So those are the hard questions we have to have. And, most of the time they're worth it, if you can build those relationships and you never forget about those relationships and those discussions. So for Sameth and others who, dare to take up this work, it can be worth it. And that's the challenge in this country, is that we've got to have those, I hate to call them courageous discussions, because we all have heard that term, and courageous discussions oftentimes don't get anywhere if it's only discussions, but you actually have to build some work out of it to make it really mean something. So you have to do it all. You have to do it all. We don't have a choice.
Cindy, there's one last question from
Mhm.
Nestor. You have encountered strong and violent challenges in your work and life. What advice do you have for those of us facing challenges or barriers in our work effort to decolonize?
I've been fortunate because our family is very supportive of the work that we all do. And I realize that most people don't have a family like ours, where you can come to a family dinner and find, a common set of politics and have a common response to various incidences and struggles. But I also am fortunate that I have longtime friends like Velma and many people that who I have a lifetime experience with. And those are the people that I know that I can always go to for support. Without that circle, I would be lost. I would feel isolated. I would feel alone. And I always know that I can turn to them and say to them, I'm not going to hide anything. I was very disappointed over the results of yesterday's election. And I told that to Velma, but I said, all it proves is that we've got a hell of a lot of work to do. So we wake up the next morning and we're ready to work, because we know that we have those people to depend on and to work with together. We have a common analysis, a common history, and that's our main support circle. And I hope that other people can find that, because that's so important, to not get pessimistic, not get burned out. You've got to find your support circle.
Velma once told me that it was a relay, not a marathon or a sprint. And I didn't quite really understand what that meant. We were very, very early on in our relationship, but I know now that she's absolutely right. We have to work with each other. I know that when I'm down, there are others that are going to be there to not only keep the struggle going, but keep me connected, make sure that I'm okay, and that it's my job to do the same. When my sisters and brothers in the struggle, when my siblings in the struggle are are tired, it's my job to make sure that they're okay. Cindy, thank you so much for being here tonight. It is always an honor to hear you talk, but it has been an absolute honor, pleasure, and I thank you. You always inspire me. Like I
Thank
said
you.
earlier today, it's just shocking that you and I haven't yet met in real life. Like, I'm still shook by that. I hope that one day we get to have
One day soon. One day soon.
we gotta make it soon, girl. Because maybe we just get Velma to invite the two of us over
Yes,
for some good
yes,
time and stuff.
definitely.
Yeah, let's get
Definitely.
her to do it. Yeah, Velma, come on, get it together, Velma. Thank you so much
Definitely.
to
Thank
you,
you.
Cindy. Thank you for your leadership, your guidance, your mentorship. You've been such an inspiration to so many of us that have only known of you. And now that we get to know you, it has been such an absolute honor to hear from you. Thank you. Thank you to the rest of you that have been with us today. We cannot wait to see you again tomorrow. We will be talking about what we're going to be doing together, how we're going to be leading the revolution, how we're going to be working to guide the revolution and make sure that some of these young kids can do the work for us, because some of us are creaking in the knees and can't do it anymore. But thank you so much. Yeah, Vilma just said I don't cook. So
I'll invite you all over.
great. Yeah, that's awesome.
It's
Although
a promise, Sharon.
I've had Velma's adobo, so I don't know what she's talking about. Thank you all so much. We will see you bright and early tomorrow to keep the siblinghood going. Know that we are here for you. Anything that we can do to ensure that you are together, we are here in solidarity and in siblinghood. My love to all of you. Thank you so much for spending your day with us today. Tomorrow, we're going to have amazing keynotes and workshops. So look forward to seeing you first thing bright and early. Thank you so much and have a great night.
Night.